It's about time I got round to this. Behind me I have 14 ultra high performance summer tyres in the popular 225/40 18 wheel size, and over the next 2 weeks I'm going to be going through 150 tyres to find out exactly which tyre is best in dry handling, wet handling, dry braking, wet braking, rolling resistance, noise, aquaplaning, to help you decide exactly what the best ultra high performance tyre is for your car. As usual, I don't like making things easy for myself, and I've seemed to have made things extra hard this time, as where possible I've spanned both ultra high performance and ultra high performance. This 18-inch tyre size has allowed me to get both the Michelin Pilot Sport 4 and 4S, the Goodyear Eagle F1 Asymmetric 5 and the F1 SuperSport, the new Pirelli P Zero, which is the first time I'll be testing it, the PZ4, and amongst all the other tyres on test, the one you've been asking me the most about, the new Bridgestone Potenza Sport. To test all of this properly, I've somehow once again talked Goodyear into lending me their insane test facility in the south of France. This will allow me to test the tyres in perfect conditions every single time, and I'll be using a trusty VW Golf GTI, which, while is a bit of a generic choice, it is a very good platform to test all these tyres on and really feel what the tyres are doing at the subjective limit. As this is 14 sets of tyres, I'm going to do my very best to get all the information into this video, but there's bound to be some stuff I miss out. So there will be a link in the description to the Tyre Reviews website on tyrereviews.com with all the glorious details for you to pore over. Can the new Bridgestone take the fight to Michelin and Goodyear, or will one of the other 11 tyres cause a bit of an upset? One way to find out. Let's go get testing. Right, we are going to start the day with dry handling, as while it perhaps isn't the most important quality for a tyre that gets used on the road, it's the one we care a little bit too much about, and it's one of the most fun. And as always, I've done my dry testing and wet testing blind, so I don't know what tyre I'm driving on as I'm testing to remove any bias. Now, the slowest two tyres were both in the 97-second bracket around this long dry handling lap. It was the Altenzo and the Avon. Now, neither of these tyres felt particularly bad on the warm-up lap. They both had relatively nice steering, perhaps not the sharpest of the bunch, but it was fine. And then as they started, they felt both okay. They maybe want a little bit more detail through the front axle, and they were an understeer balance, but that's safe for the road, but they both just lacked grip. Next up in the 96-second range was the GT Radial Nokian and Hankook. Now, the GT Radial actually felt like a really nice rounded tyre. Nice steering, sporty handling, a nice balance, not too much understeer. It was an enjoyable tyre to drive, just didn't quite have the grip of the very best. The Nokian and Hankook, similar amounts of grip, but they just didn't deliver it in an enjoyable way. They both were primary understeer, and both didn't give you a whole lot of detail through the front axle. Now, that probably gets paid back in comfort later on in the test, but they just, you wouldn't call them performance tyres. Fine levels of grip, safe balance, but they just weren't dynamic and sporty compared to some of the best on the bunch. The 95s is where it gets really competitive, with Falken, Goodyear, Vredestein and Pirelli all within a second of each other. The Falken, pleasant tyre, more sporty than I remember it in other sizes, enjoyable tyre to drive, just lacked a little bit of detail right at the very limit. The Goodyear, now the Asymmetric 5 has long been one of my favourite tyres for handling. It's just a nice objective, nice rounded tyre. And thankfully, when I was working out the results from the blind testing, I still really like the Asymmetric 5. It just feels even in all directions. It's a little bit playful if you want it to be. Very responsive tyre, and a tyre I've always enjoyed driving on. If I was going to criticise it, perhaps struggled a little bit more with traction coming out of some of the slower corners than the other tyres, but this was very small, not a huge difference compared to the best. The Vredestein, now good steering response on the Vredestein, felt sporty right up until the very limit. Again, a bit like the Falken, but a little bit more sporty than the Falken. But it just left you wondering whether the tyre was going to grip or going to slide. So, but the steering response and speed, really enjoyable tyre. As for the Pirelli, well, I finally have the PZ4 in a test, and I'm thankful I do. Very well weighted tyre, good steering, felt sporty, perhaps got a little bit gummy right at the very limit when it was hot, but otherwise really impressive tyre. Next up, the Michelin and Continental. Now, there's no denying the grip of the Michelin. Stable tyre, understeer balance, very safe behaviour, predictable, but it was predictable with understeer, and as I've moaned before about the Michelin, you lose that feedback at the limit. It doesn't give you a huge amount of detail, which is a shame, but it is the PS4, not the 4S. The Continental Premium Contact 6. Now, I don't know why Continental didn't call this tyre the Sport Contact 6, because every time I test it in whatever size, in whatever car, whatever conditions, it's always a really nice sporty handling tyre. It's a tyre I really, really like driving, and for dry handling it's darty on the steering, it's precise, and it's fast. Very, very good first lap pace. One of the tyres that didn't like the heat so much, so perhaps not the best track tyre, but on the road, impressive, sporty tyre, even though it's called the Premium Contact. The top 3 tyres were the UUHP tyres. They were these ultra high performance / max performance tyres that sit slightly above the ultra high performance tyres in performance, and they normally sacrifice a little bit of wet to get this improvement in dry. Now, it was exceptionally close between all 3 tyres in terms of time, but there were some quite subjective differences worth talking about. The Michelin was just the slowest of the 3. The 4S is a great tyre, and it has more subjective feel and handling than the 4, but it still wasn't quite up there with the Goodyear or Bridgestone. But it's a good tyre. It's a really well-rounded tyre, great package. Again, just a tiny bit numb, as I've said before about the 4S. The Bridgestone, now the Bridgestone noticeably needed more heat than the other 2, but once it was warm, yikes, this thing feels like a track tyre the way it keys into the surface. Bonkers on the brake, had good meaty sporty feeling steering, very direct, and what felt like quite a firm sidewall. When I say exceptional once it was heated up, but maybe after a couple of laps you'd pass the best of the tyre and the grip was starting to drop off a little bit. I am, if I get time, going to do another video digging in to the longer term track performance of these 3 tyres, so subscribe for that if you haven't already. But the Bridgestone, yeah, felt like a track tyre, felt very sporty, good work on this new tyre Bridgestone, really enjoyed it on dry handling. And finally, the Goodyear Eagle F1 SuperSport. Now, this wasn't quite as precise on centre, so the first bit of steering wasn't quite as darty as the Bridgestone, but it was still a very nice subjective all-round package, and it was ever so slightly the fastest, and it was probably the most stable of the 3 tyres across the 3 laps, not really dropping any time. So, I mean, that was an impressive outing for Goodyear, and you can just feel the quality of the dry handling when you're going over the curbs and the imperfections. There's just that firmness to the tyre that feels really nice and gives you that confidence to push on. So now we've done all that, can the ultra high performance tyres keep that advantage in dry braking? Well, let's go have a look and then move on to wet. Dry braking did mostly keep the advantage with the UUHP tyres, with the Pirelli, Hankook and Michelin Pilot Sport 4 doing extremely well for the ultra high performance segment. Just quickly before we start wet handling, I wanted to actually sit and talk about the wet braking results, because wet braking is such a critical factor in the overall results, because it's one of the biggest safety criteria. Now, wet braking, we put a lot of controls in to try and make sure all the variables get excluded. So we don't just do one braking run and call it that. We normally do about 10 and average out between them. We have line markers that we attach to the car, so we're using exactly the same line. We use either cone markers, or here at Goodyear we use a robot that pneumatically brakes the car automatically as it crosses a light beam. So that means exactly the same brake pressure gets applied at exactly the same point. Even with all these variables in place, there are still variances in the ABS system, wind speed, tyres, whether the tyre's engaging, so you don't get exactly the same every time, which is why we do 10 and average it out. Now, I'm explaining all this because the Hankook is so far ahead in wet braking. I've not seen it in any other tyre test, but I've tested it on 2 different cars in 3 different temperatures, and that is exactly how far ahead it is. This is a new compound, S1 Evo 3, and for whatever reason, on this low mu wet braking surface that we use at Goodyear, it's exceptional. So well done, Hankook. The other thing I wanted to note quickly was the Bridgestone. The one thing we can't control with wet braking is tyre temperature. Obviously, tyre temperature builds and then normally stabilizes because we do the loop at exactly the same speed. But the Bridgestone is the first tyre I've experienced in a long time outside of track tyres that every time you did a wet braking run, it just got a little bit better and a little bit better. So if you'd only done 1 or 2, like you would on the road, maybe on a cold day, the wet braking was average. But once you've warmed it up a few times, it got better. And then once you got some good heat in it, it seemed to get really good. So I just thought they were the 2 interesting things I wanted to talk about for wet braking, because it's such an important thing in the overall scoring of this. It was worth explaining. Now let's go do some wet handling. At the back, again, was the Altenzo. Now, with budget tyres before, I've tested quite a lot in the wet, and some of them want to kill you. Altenzo, this wasn't one of them. It was a nicely balanced tyre. It had gentle understeer, progressive, but just didn't have the grip to back it up. Wet grip is something that usually costs money, and this seems to be the case again. The next tyres in the 66-second range were the Avon and Goodyear Eagle F1 SuperSport, the UUHP. Now, they both had similar times, but they delivered it in completely different ways. The Avon, again like the Altenzo, it really nice balance, gentle understeer, safe balance, but it just was lacking the grip. The Goodyear, now this felt like it had more grip, but the balance was more towards oversteer, so you were fighting the car a little bit more, and there were points where it was aquaplaning at the rear first, and that meant you were sideways, and some corners that can help you round, but over a lap it was a negative. So the balance of the two tyres with similar times, very different subjectively, is, again, it's one of those things I find really interesting, because it just goes to show that raw data doesn't tell the whole story. Next up, it starts to get mega close with a whole bunch of tyres in the 65-second range. Nokian and Vredestein pretty much timed, with both tyres just lacking a bit of grip. And the Conti, once again, felt really sharp and sporty. Didn't have as much issue with aquaplaning as I've had in the past at this facility in this size, so that's a positive. But once it let go, you felt like you were waiting a lot to get the grip back, so it was kind of like sliding a little bit more. But with high levels of grip, that longer recovery is often a case. The Michelin Pilot Sport 4S, now this was the nicest balanced of the three UUHP tyres, and felt like it had good grip. Now, strangely, with the Hankook being so far ahead in wet braking, I thought it was going to be exceptional in wet handling, and it just wasn't. Like in the dry, it just left you wanting a little bit more information to the front axle. And while it did feel the best in wet braking for that slow speed corner I've coincidentally just gone through, it wasn't as stark as it was on the wet braking testing. So it had an advantage, but it definitely felt like that advantage had lessened, and it wasn't, laterally it couldn't quite back up its amazing stopping ability, hence the slightly slower time. Impressive result from the GT Radial. It did better in wet handling than it did in the wet braking, and like in the dry, felt like a really nice tyre to drive. Good steering, good balance, could be a little bit playful, it just didn't quite have the grip overall. Falken and Goodyear, again, two tyres on very similar times but with very different styles. The Falken, nice quick steering. This is a more sporty FK510 than I remember previously in different sizes. Quick steering, but you ended up fighting oversteer a little bit. As you get that really sharp turn in on the front, you end up going a little bit sideways. And the Goodyear, now the Goodyear was just another really pleasant tyre to drive. No surprises, good subjectively. A little bit of understeer or a little bit of oversteer if you really wanted it. If you wanted to play, could be an enjoyable tyre to drive in the wet. Top three, now things are getting more serious. The PZ4 was next. Now, I've been watching this tyre for the past 12 months do really, really well in tests where wet handling is a big criteria. And thankfully in my test, it matched. I'm really glad to have this tyre as I was in the dry. Felt sporty, good balance, and felt like it had really good traction out of the corners. So that was one place where I noticed the Pirelli really, really did excel. In second place was the new Bridgestone Potenza Sport. Now this tyre, I can't quite get my head around this tyre. Needed a bit of heat again, I've discussed this before. Aquaplaned a lot, must have a very low starting tread depth, so you were fighting the tyre around the lap. But when it was warm and when you were in contact with the surface, it had a lot of grip. So it was a fighty lap. I enjoyed it as a challenge for a driver, but it's not what you want on the road, but the grip's there. And finally, with a very similar time, but delivering it again in a completely different way, was the Michelin Pilot Sport 4, not 4S. This 4, Michelin make very good tyres, we know this. The grip from this tyre was consistent, predictable, a slight understeer balance. You couldn't really get it to oversteer unless you were really fighting it. So again, the 4, not the most fun tyre you're ever going to drive, but you just can't argue with the grip. It was there in oodles. The aquaplaning test had a surprise win for the UHP GT Radial, with the Michelin Pilot Sport 4S significantly ahead of its other UUHP rivals. Now, onto the final results. First up, before we get into this, here are some things I know you want to know about the tyres that I've not touched upon so far in the video. Tyre weights, starting tread depths and the all-important rim protection are on the screen now. As for comfort, I didn't get time to really dig into the comfort of the tyres, as with this many sets of tyres, it would have been a huge task and I just didn't have the time. From all the driving I've done on them, and that's a lot, I'm fairly confident saying Pirelli and Hankook always seem to be noticeably more comfortable than the group. Then Nokian, the Michelin Pilot Sport 4 and the Goodyear Eagle F1 Asymmetric 5 were also ahead of the group, but maybe a little bit behind the first two. The rest of them really extremely close. So the final order, I've been struggling with the correct way of presenting, as with this many sets of tyres and this many tests, you can balance the scores in lots of different ways and have lots of different variations of the results. I've come to the conclusion that a strict numbered order for the test isn't the best way of delivering this information, as everything being so close, especially at the top, a slight change in preferences, as I've said, upsets the order and has a different first, second, third maybe. What generally doesn't change with these slight changes in the score weighting is the groups of the results. There are a number of sets of tyres that cluster together and move around inside the group, so I'm going to do my best to talk about them in groups where it makes sense to. Starting with the ultra high performance tyres, we find ourselves again in the situation where the cheapest tyre on test was objectively the worst overall, even if it did have the lowest rolling resistance and the second lowest noise on test. Handling wise, it wasn't upsetting, it just lacked grip in all directions, and the key wet and dry braking test, the tyre took way longer for the car to stop than any of the other tyres, so probably not recommended this, even for the price. Next up was the Avon ZV7. Again, the tyre handled fine, but lacked grip in a really strange mirror of the Altenzo. It had very low rolling resistance and very good in the noise, so that's a bit of an odd one. The next group of tyres were Vredestein, Nokian and GT Radial. The Vredestein Ultrac Vorti Plus peaked in the dry handling test, and I know I've already said it, but it was the least phased tyre by the hard laps, which is great for a track tyre, but less so for a road tyre, as this seems to have compromised it in other areas, especially wet. The Nokian PowerProof was a very comfortable tyre to drive on, but sadly that had no weight in the overall results. And while it wasn't offensively bad in any area, it just didn't quite match the best in any of the areas. So a little bit disappointing for Nokian, but I'm sure the next iteration of tyres will be much better because they've got a new test facility and they're really pushing development. The new GT Radial SportActive 2, however, won both the aquaplaning tests, which certainly helped it around the wet handling lap, and it always felt nice and sporty to drive on. It was just a pleasant tyre to drive on, but sadly its wet and dry braking results let it down. The Falken Azenis FK510 was a surprise. The previous times I've tested the FK510, it's always been one of the more comfortable tyres, but it's not been the most sporty. I've tested it in different sizes. But this, good levels of sportiness and perhaps lacking in the comfort. It seems to have flipped, but you can tell by the construction it's a really firm tyre when in other sizes it hasn't been. Its weakness was dry braking, and it had a very high rolling resistance, but it was good enough in the wet that I'm happy to call this a good tyre. Like, you won't be disappointed if you buy the tyre, especially at the price point that Falken normally sits at. Continental and Pirelli were next, and I'm definitely recommending both these tyres, but for different reasons. The Continental Premium Contact 6, well, I've said it before, I don't know why it's not called the Sport Contact. It was the fastest of the ultra high performance tyres in the dry and felt the most sporty, had the nicest, quickest steering, gave you good feedback, and it was just a nice handling tyre. If it had fared a little bit better in wet handling and wet braking, it would have been one of the very best tyres here, as it did exceptionally well in the aquaplaning tests and had a low rolling resistance. In fact, the only big red mark against its name was the external noise, but that wasn't actually that noticeable in the cabin. The Pirelli was another tyre that was excellent in dry handling, feeling sporty, had the shortest dry braking distance, and it was very good in the wet, with its wet handling and wet braking results being amongst the best. It just struggled a little bit in the aquaplaning test. If you're not bothered about deeper water or aquaplaning, this tyre is an excellent choice. And even if you are, it's still a very good choice because it's just an excellent all-round tyre. Next up is this new specification Hankook Ventus S1 Evo 3 with its rather fancy tread pattern. This Hankook could have won the test on its wet braking result alone. It was that far ahead of the group. It was, however, an excellent tyre, not just in wet, but in dry braking as well, so can't be ignored as a good purchase, and had good levels of comfort for a UHP tyre. Like the Pirelli previously, it just had average aquaplaning resistance and a relatively high rolling resistance, which kept it out of the very top group. And finally, for the ultra high performance tyres, with two tyres essentially tied overall for the win, the Goodyear Eagle F1 Asymmetric 5 and the Michelin Pilot Sport 4. The interesting thing is that between these two tyres and all the testing we've done over the course of the 2 weeks, There was only one test win between these two tyres, and that was Michelin in wet handling. And that was only by 0.3 seconds over the Pirelli. This goes to prove that no tyre can be the best in every category. And if you try to be really good in one category, you probably lose out in other areas. What both these tyres do, and why I believe they're the best overall ultra high performance tyres for road driving, is have no big disadvantages. They just work well in pretty much every test, with both tyres scoring in the top 4 for every grip and aquaplaning test. Hugely impressive breadth of ability from these two. I just can't describe how important it is to be good everywhere, which is why I'm rating these two as the best. However, if you have other preferences for what you regard as the best, you now have all the data to make your own purchase choice. So I guess that's the point in this video. Overall, these two, but if you've got your own preferences, you can use the data. Finally, the 3 ultra high performance tyres, the Goodyear Eagle F1 SuperSport, the new Bridgestone Potenza Sport, and the Michelin Pilot Sport 4S. It was really interesting having them in this overall test to see how they do compare to the ultra high performance tyres, and that they do dominate in the dry, but this comes at a compromise of wet handling, noise and rolling resistance. And in the case of the Goodyear and Bridgestone, aquaplaning. The Eagle F1 SuperSport was exceptional in dry handling, but not the easiest to get around that wet handling lap. But as a road tyre that you can use on track, it does it really well. You can feel in the construction, it's probably the firmest here. The wet performance was actually a little bit surprising, as in other sizes, other facilities, in other cars, it's actually been very good in the wet. So perhaps it just doesn't like this size, or perhaps it doesn't like the front wheel drive platform. I'm not sure, but very good tyre still, but just, you can feel it on track, insane. The Bridgestone was equally as impressive in the dry, just a tiny bit slow, but there was nothing in it. And while it seemed to need heat like a track compound does, it gripped like one too. In the wet, it was tricky, but once it warmed up, the grip was fantastic. But like I said in the wet handling part, you really had to fight it around the lap because of aquaplaning, and it does have the shallowest starting tread depth, so that makes sense. I'm not really sure how that's going to translate to the real world, especially on like a cold winter's morning, but I'm going to try and get a set for a long-term review at some point to really dig into that. But it's really nice to have Bridgestone back. It's a really impressive tyre, and if it has the longevity of a road tyre with the grip of a track tyre, it's going to be a winner. And finally, the Michelin Pilot Sport 4S, the tyre we all know and love. As usual, the 4S didn't feel the sportiest on track, but like its little brother, you can't argue with this tyre's all-round ability of grip in all conditions. Even dealt with aquaplaning much better than these two, which is impressive for the ultra high performance tyre that does well in the dry. But like you say, you do lose that handling precision that you really want from this category. But there you are, pick your poison. You can have this lovely rounded tyre that seems to do everything well, but you just don't have that, that 10th driving enjoyment, or you can bolt on one of these absolutely insane road tyres and love driving. Well, thank you again. If you've got this far, you deserve some sort of medal. Once again, thanks to Goodyear. Without tyre manufacturers supporting independent, truly independent testing like mine, tyre tests wouldn't exist, and the tyre market would be hugely tricky to navigate because you just wouldn't really know what you're getting into. But thankfully, like my tests and all tests across Europe from all the magazines, they're all done at tyre tests proving grounds. So thank you again to Goodyear. Huge respect for risking their tyre doing very badly at home. Luckily, the Asymmetric 5 was one of the very best, and I always really enjoy this. So thank you again to Goodyear. Go and review your own tyres at tyrereviews.com if you haven't already. Really useful for everyone. There's a lot of people going through the tyrereviews.com website trying to make their tyre purchase decisions. It's not just a YouTube channel, so please head over there and review your own tyres. As always, any questions, please ask below. And as always, safe motoring.